There are certain moments in baseball that exist outside of time, suspended like dust motes in the amber light of a late afternoon game. They hover there, caught between what was and what might have been, between the crack of the bat and the settling of the ball into worn leather. Pete Rose knew thousands of such moments. He lived inside them, breathed them, became them. But there is one moment, one terrible, inevitable moment, where time stopped not for glory, but for something else entirely, something that would cast shadows across all those other golden instants, darkening them like clouds moving across the sun. We begin, as all baseball stories must, with the sound of cleats on concrete, the hollow echo of spikes against the tunnel floor, that distinctive rhythm that every ballplayer knows by heart. It's morning in Cincinnati, sometime in the spring of 1987, and Pete Rose is walking toward the light of Riverfront Stadium. His steps are measured, familiar. He has walked this path thousands of times before. But today, though he doesn't know it yet, he is walking toward the edge of everything he has ever known. The air carries the scent of cut grass and chalk lines, that particular perfume of possibility that only exists in a ballpark before the crowds arrive. Rose breathes it in deeply, the way a man might breathe in the last clean air before a storm. His hands, those famous hands that have gripped a bat more than 14,000 times in major league games, hang loose at his sides. They are carpenter's hands, built for honest work, calloused and strong. They have never trembled, not in the ninth inning of a World Series game, not facing Nolan Ryan's fastball, not when the pressure was at its whitest heat. But there are other kinds of pressure building now, invisible forces that have nothing to do with baseball and everything to do with the spaces between the games, the quiet hours when the stadium empties and a man is left alone with his hungers. Pete Rose was born to play baseball the way some men are born to breathe. It was not a choice so much as a biological imperative, written into his DNA, alongside his heartbeat and the color of his eyes. From the sandlots of Cincinnati, where the Ohio River curves like a question mark around the city's edge, he emerged fully formed, a complete player who understood that baseball was not just a game, but a philosophy, a way of being in the world that demanded everything and gave back exactly what you earned. They called him Charlie Hustle, though the nickname began as mockery and transformed into something like reverence. In an era when baseball was becoming increasingly corporate, when players wore their indifference like expensive cologne, Rose played with the desperate joy of a kid who might never get another chance. He ran to first base on walks. He slid headfirst into bases when a standing slide would do. He dove for balls that were already past him, not because he thought he could catch them, but because the act of diving was itself a kind of prayer, a physical manifestation of effort that transcended result. Watch him in 1973, the year he won the National League MVP award despite being a second baseman who hit only 16 home runs. It is September, late in the season, and the Reds are playing the Giants in a meaningless game. Rose comes to bat in the seventh inning with 2 outs and nobody on base. The score doesn't matter. The game doesn't matter. The season is effectively over. But Rose steps into the batter's box with the same fierce concentration he would bring to Game 7 of the World Series. He fouls off pitch after pitch, working the count, making the pitcher throw strikes, extending the at-bat not because it serves any strategic purpose, but because this is what he does. This is who he is. When he finally singles to left field, he runs through first base as if the devil himself were chasing him, though the ball is already in the glove and there is no chance of a second base. This is the Pete Rose we remember first, the player who accumulated 4,256 hits not through sudden bursts of brilliance, but through the steady, relentless application of will. Each hit was a small victory over entropy, over the natural tendency of things to fall apart. He played 24 seasons in the major leagues, longer than most careers in any profession, sustained by an almost mystical belief in the virtue of effort. He believed, with the faith of a medieval monk, that wanting something badly enough could make it happen. But wanting is a dangerous thing. It lives in the muscle and bone, but it also lives in the spaces between, in the quiet hours when the game is over and the crowd has gone home. And Pete Rose wanted more than hits, more than records, more than the approval of fans who chanted his name until their voices went hoarse. He wanted the quickening of blood that comes with risk, the sharp clarity that arrives only when something important hangs in the balance. The first bet was probably innocent enough. A friendly wager between teammates, the kind of thing that happens in clubhouses across the country every day. $20 on a football game, maybe, or $50 on a boxing match. The money wasn't the point. Rose made millions playing baseball. The point was the betting itself, the transformation of passive watching into active participation. When you have money on a game, every play matters. Every yard gained or lost is a small personal victory or defeat. The emotional stakes rise to match the financial ones, and suddenly you are not just watching but living inside the game, connected to it by invisible threads of self-interest. From football, it was a short step to basketball, from basketball to hockey, from hockey to horses. The world revealed itself to be full of contests, each one an opportunity to test not just your knowledge, but your nerve. Rose began to carry a small notebook in his back pocket, filled with scratched calculations and abbreviated team names. He made calls from payphones in stadium corridors, speaking in the coded language of odds and point spreads. He developed relationships with men whose names he never learned, voices on the other end of long-distance lines who spoke in numbers and percentages. The amounts grew slowly at first, then more quickly. $100 became 500. 500 became 1,000. The numbers had a life of their own, expanding like a gas to fill whatever container held them. Rose told himself he was in control, that he was simply using his superior knowledge of sports to turn a profit. After all, who understood competition better than a man who had competed at the highest level for more than 2 decades? Who had better instincts about the subtle dynamics that determine winners and losers? But gambling is not about knowledge. It is about hope and fear, about the illusion of control in a universe that operates according to principles too complex for any human mind to grasp fully. Each bet was a small act of faith, a belief that this time would be different, that this time the universe would bend to accommodate his will. And when the universe failed to cooperate, when the favorite lost or the underdog covered the spread, the solution was always the same. Bet again, bet bigger. Bet with the confidence of a man who had never failed at anything that mattered. By 1985, Rose was betting thousands of dollars on individual games. He owed money to bookmakers in Cincinnati and New York, men who operated in the shadows between legitimate business and something darker. The debts created their own momentum, generating interest and urgency that demanded constant attention. Rose found himself making bets not because he wanted to, but because he had to, caught in a cycle where each wager was simultaneously an attempt to solve his problems, and a guarantee that those problems would grow larger. The irony was exquisite and terrible. Pete Rose, who had built his reputation on reliability, on showing up every day and performing the same simple tasks with mechanical precision, had become unreliable. His attention, which had once been focused with laser intensity on the subtle details of hitting and fielding, was now scattered across a dozen different games and outcomes. He would sit in the dugout during Reds games, his mind calculating point spreads and money lines while his team played out the late innings of what might be a close contest. The notebook in his back pocket grew thicker. The phone calls became more frequent and more urgent. Rose began to associate with men who existed on the margins of sports, former players who had found other ways to make money from games, bookmakers who operated out of restaurants and social clubs, handicappers who sold their expertise to anyone willing to pay for insider information. These were not evil men, necessarily, but they lived in a world where the lines between competition and commerce had long since blurred beyond recognition. In 1986, Rose retired as a player, but remained as manager of the Cincinnati Reds. The transition should have marked a new chapter in his relationship with baseball, a movement from physical participation to intellectual guidance. Instead, it freed him from the daily discipline of preparation and practice, giving him more time to pursue the parallel universe of betting that had gradually consumed more and more of his attention. As manager, he had access to information that ordinary bettors could never obtain. Which pitchers were nursing sore arms, which players were dealing with personal problems, which teams were suffering from internal discord. This information was not intended for gambling purposes, but it was impossible to ignore its potential value. The phone calls continued, the notebooks filled with more entries. The amounts grew larger still. Rose was betting $5,000 on individual games, sometimes more. He was betting on basketball games between colleges he had never heard of, on the outcomes of tennis matches played on the other side of the world. He was betting on baseball games, major league games, games involving teams other than the Reds. And then, inevitably, he crossed the final line. It was probably a Tuesday in April 1987, though the exact date has been lost to the peculiar amnesia that surrounds such moments. Rose was in his office at Riverfront Stadium, the same office where he had celebrated division championships and planned strategies for playoff runs. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting everything in the golden tones that make baseball fields look like paradise. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "I want to put 5,000 on the Reds tonight," he said. The words hung in the air like smoke. Once spoken, they could not be taken back. They transformed Pete Rose from a gambler who happened to manage a baseball team into a baseball manager who was gambling on his own team. The distinction was crucial, the difference between a personal failing and a betrayal of everything baseball represents. Baseball, more than any other sport, depends on the faith of its audience. Fans invest not just money, but emotional capital in the belief that what they are watching is authentic, that the players and managers are trying their hardest to win every game. This faith is fragile, built up over decades, and capable of being destroyed in an instant. When a manager bets on his own team, he introduces a variable that makes authentic competition impossible. Even if he bets on his team to win, even if his financial interests align with his professional responsibilities, the mere fact of the bet changes everything. Decisions about when to remove a starting pitcher, when to use the closer, when to pinch hit for a struggling player. These decisions are no longer made purely on the basis of what gives the team the best chance to win that particular game. They are influenced, however subtly, by the knowledge that money rides on the outcome. Rose told himself that it made no difference. He was betting on the Reds to win, which meant his financial interests and his managerial responsibilities pointed in the same direction. If anything, the bet gave him additional incentive to manage aggressively, to pull out all the stops in pursuit of victory. But this logic, however superficially appealing, missed the deeper point. Baseball is not just about winning individual games. It is about managing resources across an entire season, about making strategic decisions that might cost you tonight's game but improve your chances of winning next week's series. When a manager has money riding on tonight's game, these long-term considerations become secondary to the immediate need to cash a winning ticket. The bets on the Reds became routine. Not every game. Rose was too smart for that, but often enough to establish a pattern. He would study the matchups, consider the pitching rotations, evaluate the strength of the opposing team, then make his decision. $5,000 on the Reds. Sometimes $10,000. The amounts varied, but the essential transaction remained the same. Pete Rose, manager of the Cincinnati Reds, was gambling on the outcome of games he was paid to manage. The money mattered less than the psychological relief. Each bet was a way of asserting control over circumstances that had begun to feel uncontrollable. Rose owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to bookmakers who were growing increasingly impatient with his delays in payment. The interest on these debts compounded daily, creating a mathematical progression that threatened to overwhelm even his substantial income. By betting on his own team, he was attempting to use his insider knowledge to generate the winnings he needed to solve his problems. But the problems continued to grow. The Reds did not win every game that Rose bet on them. Baseball, with its long season and its inherent unpredictability, is perhaps the most difficult sport to bet successfully. Even the best teams lose 60 games a year. Even the worst teams win 60. The margin between success and failure is smaller in baseball than in any other major sport. And that margin is precisely where gambling fortunes are made and lost. Rose's debts mounted. His creditors became more aggressive in their collection efforts. Men appeared at the stadium asking to speak with him privately. Phone calls came at all hours, voices demanding payment in tones that carried subtle but unmistakable threats. Rose found himself juggling multiple financial obligations, paying one bookmaker with money borrowed from another, staying one step ahead of consequences that grew more serious with each passing day. The stress began to show in his managing. Rose had always been known for his emotional intensity, his willingness to argue with umpires and berate players who failed to hustle. But now his anger had a different quality, less connected to the immediate circumstances of the game and more reflective of pressures that had nothing to do with baseball. He would explode at players for minor mistakes, then retreat into long silences that left everyone around him uncertain about his state of mind. The notebook in his back pocket became a constant presence, consulted between innings and during pitching changes. Rose would flip through its pages, checking odds and calculating potential payouts, while his team played out crucial late-inning situations. The other coaches began to notice his distraction, the way his attention would drift from the game to something else entirely. But baseball culture discourages such observations. Managers are entitled to their private thoughts, their personal methods of processing information. If Pete Rose wanted to keep a notebook and make phone calls during games, that was his business. Except it wasn't just his business. It was baseball's business, and baseball had rules about gambling that were as old as the game itself. These rules were not suggestions or guidelines. They were absolute prohibitions, born from hard experience with the damage that gambling could inflict on the sport's integrity. Posted in every clubhouse in Major League Baseball was Rule 21, which stated in clear, unambiguous language that any player, umpire, or club official who bet on baseball games would be declared permanently ineligible. The rule made no exceptions for betting on your own team to win. It made no distinctions between large bets and small ones. It was a bright line, drawn in permanent ink, separating acceptable behavior from behavior that threatened the fundamental assumptions on which baseball was built. Rose knew Rule 21. Every person connected with professional baseball knew Rule 21. It was impossible to ignore, posted as it was in clubhouses and repeated in training sessions and written into every contract. But knowledge and understanding are different things, and understanding and acceptance are different still. Rose had spent his entire adult life in a world where rules were negotiable, where the enforcement of regulations depended on the relative power and influence of the people involved. He had seen players use illegal substances to enhance their performance, seen owners manipulate roster rules to gain competitive advantages, seen umpires make calls that clearly favored certain teams over others. The gap between official policy and actual practice was large enough to drive a truck through, and Rose had convinced himself that his gambling fell into that gap, that it was one of those things that everybody knew about but nobody talked about. He was wrong. The gambling was noticed, investigated, and documented by people whose job it was to protect baseball's integrity. Private investigators hired by the commissioner's office began tracking Rose's activities, photographing his meetings with known bookmakers, recording his phone conversations, assembling a case that would eventually fill several filing cabinets with evidence of systematic rule violations. The investigation was thorough and professional, conducted by former FBI agents who understood the importance of building an airtight case before making any accusations. The investigators followed Rose to racetracks and gymnasiums, to restaurants where he met with men who made their living from other people's hope. They documented bets and recorded conversations. They traced phone calls and analyzed financial records. They built a timeline that stretched back months, showing a pattern of escalating involvement with gambling that culminated in the ultimate transgression, betting on games he was managing. Meanwhile, Rose continued his double life, managing the Reds by day and gambling by night, unaware that his every move was being watched and recorded. He functioned on multiple levels simultaneously, drawing from deep wells of experience and expertise to make strategic decisions about pitching changes and defensive alignments, while maintaining a parallel existence in the shadowy world of odds and point spreads. The two worlds began to bleed into each other in ways that even Rose probably didn't fully understand. There were games where his managerial decisions seemed influenced by considerations that had nothing to do with baseball strategy. Pitchers left in too long or removed too early. Pinch hitters used in situations that called for different tactics. Subtle alterations in the normal rhythms of decision-making that suggested the presence of motivations beyond the simple desire to win. These changes were not dramatic enough to attract immediate attention, but they were there, like faint traces of a foreign substance in what should have been pure water. The investigation continued through the 1987 season and into the winter that followed. Evidence accumulated like snow. each piece small in itself, but collectively forming a weight that could not be ignored. Phone records showing calls to known bookmakers. Financial documents revealing large cash transactions with no apparent legitimate purpose. Testimony from associates who had witnessed Rose placing bets on baseball games. Photographs of Rose at locations where such bets were commonly made. By early 1988, the Commissioner's office had assembled enough evidence to proceed with formal charges. But first, there would be one more chance for Rose to tell the truth, to acknowledge his mistakes and accept whatever consequences might follow. Baseball, for all its tough rhetoric about rules and punishments, preferred to handle its problems quietly, without the publicity that accompanied formal disciplinary proceedings. If Rose was willing to admit his guilt and accept a reasonable penalty, the entire matter could be resolved without the kind of spectacle that would damage the sport's reputation. But Pete Rose had never been in the habit of accepting defeat. His entire career had been built on the principle that effort could overcome any obstacle, that wanting something badly enough could make it happen. He had played hurt, played sick, played through personal problems that would have sidelined lesser men. He had accumulated more hits than any player in baseball history, not through superior talent, but through superior persistence. The idea of admitting defeat, of acknowledging that he had been beaten by his own weaknesses, was foreign to everything he understood about himself. So, when Commissioner Peter Ueberroth's investigators approached him in the spring of 1989, Rose did what he had always done when faced with adversity. He fought back. He denied the allegations. He questioned the motives of his accusers. He hired lawyers and public relations specialists. He transformed what might have been a private acknowledgement of guilt into a public battle over truth and justice. The hearing that followed was unlike anything in baseball history. For weeks, lawyers presented evidence and cross-examined witnesses in a proceeding that resembled a criminal trial more than a typical baseball disciplinary hearing. Rose sat at the defendant's table. His famous intensity now focused on legal strategy rather than batting averages. The man who had once been celebrated for his openness and accessibility became guarded and evasive, parsing every question as if his life depended on the precision of his answers. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Phone records, financial documents, eyewitness testimony. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. Pete Rose had been gambling on baseball games, including games involving his own team. The investigators had built their case methodically, cross-referencing different sources of information to create a picture so complete that denial seemed not just futile but absurd. But Rose continued to deny. Even when confronted with direct evidence of his betting activities, he maintained his innocence with the same fierce determination he had once brought to turning a single into a double. He challenged the credibility of witnesses. He questioned the authenticity of documents. He suggested that the investigation was motivated by personal animosity rather than genuine concern for baseball's integrity. The spectacle was painful to watch. Here was Pete Rose, the man who had embodied baseball's virtues of hard work and determination, reduced to legal maneuvering and semantic quibbling. The same qualities that had made him great as a player, his refusal to accept defeat, his ability to find ways to succeed where others failed, now worked against him, preventing him from acknowledging a truth that everyone else could see clearly. On August 24, 1989, Commissioner A. Bartlett Giamatti announced his decision. Pete Rose was banned from baseball for life. The announcement was brief and formal, stripped of the emotion that had characterized the preceding months of investigation and hearings. Rose was declared permanently ineligible, prohibited from any involvement with organized baseball, his name removed from all official records, and his achievements rendered invisible in the eyes of the sport he had served for nearly 3 decades. The punishment was swift and absolute. There would be no gradual transition, no opportunity to wind down his involvement with the game. One day, Pete Rose was the manager of the Cincinnati Reds, a man whose opinion on baseball matters was sought and valued. The next day, he was a private citizen whose connection to the sport existed only in memory and record books. The ban extended beyond Rose himself to affect his legacy, his place in baseball history, his eligibility for the Hall of Fame. All of it was swept away in a single administrative decision, the accumulated achievements of 4,256 hits rendered meaningless by the discovery that the man who accumulated them had violated the fundamental rules that governed the game. The news spread through baseball like a shock wave. Players who had competed against Rose, managers who had learned from his example, fans who had cheered his accomplishments, all of them were forced to reconsider what they thought they knew about one of the game's most visible personalities. The man they had admired for his intensity and dedication was revealed to have been living a double life, using his position in baseball to support activities that threatened the sport's integrity. Rose's initial response was characteristic: defiant denial mixed with righteous indignation. He claimed he was the victim of a witch hunt, targeted by officials who resented his success and popularity. He hired more lawyers and launched appeals that would continue for years. He gave interviews proclaiming his innocence and challenging anyone to prove he had done anything wrong. The same stubbornness that had made him a great player now made him a tiresome defendant, unable or unwilling to accept responsibility for his actions. But the evidence was too strong and too public to be overcome by legal maneuvering. Rose's associates began to tell their stories, describing in detail the bets they had witnessed him place and the conversations they had overheard. Financial records documented large cash transactions that could not be explained by any legitimate activity. Phone records showed patterns of communication with known bookmakers that coincided exactly with the timing of important baseball games. Gradually, the weight of evidence began to erode Rose's position. His denials became less categorical, his explanations more complex and nuanced. He began to acknowledge that he might have associated with unsavory characters without admitting that he had done anything wrong himself. He suggested that his accusers might be telling the truth about some things while lying about others. He retreated step by step from his original position of absolute innocence toward something that resembled acknowledgement without quite reaching it. The process took years. Rose's legal appeals worked their way through baseball's administrative structure and into the federal court system. Each decision upheld the commissioner's ruling, finding that the evidence supported the conclusions and that the punishment was appropriate to the violations. But Rose continued to fight, unwilling to accept a verdict that would end his connection to the game that had defined his entire adult life. Meanwhile, baseball moved on without him. The Cincinnati Reds hired a new manager. Other teams filled their coaching positions with men who had not been banned from the sport. The game that had once seemed unimaginable without Pete Rose's presence adapted to his absence with the same resilience that had allowed it to survive 2 world wars, a depression, and countless other challenges. Rose himself struggled to find a new identity. For 24 years, he had been Pete Rose, the baseball player. For 4 years after that, He had been Pete Rose, the baseball manager. Now he was simply Pete Rose, a middle-aged man with no clear purpose and no obvious skills beyond those that had made him famous in a sport from which he was permanently excluded. He tried various business ventures, opened restaurants, signed autographs at memorabilia shows, appeared on television programs where his notoriety was treated as a form of entertainment. But these activities were shadows of his former life, pale substitutes for the intensity and purpose that had defined his existence when he was actively involved in baseball. He had become a celebrity rather than an athlete, famous for his disgrace rather than his accomplishments. The years passed slowly. Rose's hair turned gray, then white. His body, which had once been a precision instrument calibrated for athletic competition, began to show the effects of age and inactivity. He put on weight, developed the soft appearance of a man whose physical challenges were no longer measured in innings and at-bats. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Pete Rose was becoming an old man whose best days were behind him. But he never stopped hoping for reinstatement. Year after year, he submitted applications to be readmitted to baseball. He hired new lawyers and public relations specialists. He gave interviews expressing remorse for his mistakes and pledging to serve as an example for young players who might be tempted by similar activities. He did charity work and community service, trying to demonstrate that he had learned from his experience and deserved a second chance. The applications were rejected routinely. Baseball's position was that Rose had never fully acknowledged his guilt, never taken complete responsibility for his actions. Until he was willing to tell the whole truth about his gambling activities, there could be no consideration of reducing his punishment. The sport that had once embraced him as its most dedicated competitor now viewed him as a pariah whose continued presence would only serve as a reminder of how badly things could go wrong when fundamental rules were violated. In 2004, 15 years after his banishment, Rose finally broke his silence completely. In a book titled My Prison Without Bars, he acknowledged for the first time that he had bet on baseball games, including games involving his own team. The admission was carefully qualified, limited to specific activities during a defined period, but it represented a dramatic departure from years of absolute denial. The confession should have been cathartic, a moment of truth that cleared the air and allowed everyone to move forward. Instead, it felt calculated and incomplete, timed to coincide with the book's publication and hedged with qualifications that suggested Rose was still not willing to tell the complete story. The admission raised as many questions as it answered. How many games had he bet on? How much money was involved? What other rules might he have violated? Rose's partial confession satisfied neither his critics, who wanted complete honesty, nor his supporters, who had believed his denials and now felt betrayed by the revelation that he had been lying for 15 years. The years continued to pass. Rose's applications for reinstatement continued to be rejected. His appearances at memorabilia shows and autograph signings became routine, a predictable circuit of conventions and card shows where aging fans could meet the man who had once embodied their dreams of baseball glory. He signed thousands of photographs and baseballs, his signature becoming as much a commodity as his hitting had once been. The irony was inescapable. Pete Rose, who had been banned from baseball for his involvement with gambling, was now making his living from his association with baseball, selling memories of achievements that officially no longer existed. In 2015, Commissioner Rob Manfred reviewed Rose's case and concluded that there was still insufficient evidence of genuine reform to justify reinstatement. The decision was detailed and thorough, citing Rose's continued involvement with gambling activities and his failure to demonstrate the kind of character change that would be necessary before he could be trusted with any role in organized baseball. Rose responded with characteristic defiance, questioning the decision and maintaining that he had been treated unfairly. But his protests carried less weight now. The complaints of an old man whose relevance was measured in decades rather than years. The game had moved on without him, developed new stars and new controversies, created new memories to replace the ones he had provided. And so Pete Rose remains in exile, the hit king without a kingdom, the player who accumulated more hits than anyone in baseball history, but cannot be considered for the Hall of Fame because of decisions he made away from the field. He is 79 years old now, his hair white as winter, his body bearing the accumulated weight of years and regrets. He still signs autographs at memorabilia shows, still gives interviews to reporters who want to rehash the details of his fall from grace. But the audience for these performances grows smaller each year, as fans who remember his playing days are replaced by younger generations, who know him primarily as a cautionary tale. The tragedy of Pete Rose is not that he gambled on baseball. The tragedy is that he gambled away everything that made him special, trading the respect and admiration of millions of fans for the temporary thrill of action and the false hope of easy money. He had achieved something that very few people in any field ever achieve. He had become the best in the world at something that mattered to millions of people. He had earned a place in history, a legacy that would have lasted long after his death. And he threw it all away for betting slips and point spreads, for the illusion of control over outcomes that were always beyond anyone's control. There are lessons in Pete Rose's story, but they are not simple lessons. They cannot be reduced to easy morals about the dangers of gambling or the importance of following rules. The truth is more complex and more disturbing, that the same qualities that make someone great at one thing can destroy them in another context. Rose's intensity, his refusal to accept defeat, his belief that wanting something badly enough could make it happen. These were the traits that made him a great baseball player. They were also the traits that made him a compulsive gambler, unable to walk away from bets even when the stakes had grown beyond his ability to pay. Pete Rose wanted to win at everything, and that desire for universal victory ultimately cost him the one thing he had actually mastered. He remains the hit king, but he reigns over a kingdom he can never visit, a realm of memory and record books from which he is permanently exiled. His 4,256 hits are still in the record books, but they exist there like artifacts from a civilization that no longer acknowledges his existence. The story continues, even now. Rose continues to apply for reinstatement, continues to hope that somehow the passage of time will soften the hard edges of justice. Baseball continues to reject his applications, maintains its position that some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. And fans continue to debate whether a lifetime ban is appropriate punishment for betting on games, whether Rose's achievements as a player should outweigh his failures as a manager and citizen. These debates will likely continue long after Pete Rose is gone, long after everyone who saw him play has joined him in whatever realm awaits former ballplayers. But the essential facts will remain unchanged. Pete Rose was the greatest hitter in baseball history, and Pete Rose was banned from baseball for life because he could not resist the temptation to bet on the games he was paid to manage. Both statements are true, and neither one cancels out the other. They exist together in the permanent record, twin monuments to human achievement and human failure, reminders that greatness and tragedy are often separated by nothing more than a single decision, a single moment when a man chooses who he wants to be. In the end, that may be Pete Rose's greatest contribution to baseball history. Not his 4,256 hits, impressive as they are, but his demonstration that no one is too successful, too admired, or too important to destroy themselves through poor choices. His story serves as a permanent warning posted in every clubhouse, a reminder that the game is bigger than any individual player, and that some rules exist not to be tested, but to be respected absolutely. The warning is written in the language of statistics and records, in the gap between what was achieved and what was lost, in the silence where Pete Rose's voice should be heard among the other great players discussing strategy and technique. It is a warning written in absence, in the space between accomplishment and recognition, in the terrible mathematics of addition and subtraction that govern not just baseball but life itself. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps Pete Rose's greatest gift to baseball is not the memory of his sliding headfirst into third base or his clutch hitting in crucial games, but the knowledge that no achievement is so great that it cannot be forfeited, no success so complete that it cannot be undone. The Hit King sits on a throne in a kingdom he can never enter, ruling over subjects who can never acknowledge his reign. It is a strange kind of immortality, but it is immortality nonetheless, purchased with the very currency that should have secured his place in history. The dust settles slowly on stories like this one. It takes years, sometimes decades, for the full shape of events to become clear, for the various perspectives to crystallize into something approaching consensus. Pete Rose's story is still settling, still finding its final form in the collective memory of baseball fans and historians. But certain elements seem fixed now, as permanent as his statistics in the record books. He was the best at what he did, and he threw it all away. He accumulated more hits than any player in history, and he was banned from the Hall of Fame. He embodied baseball's virtues of hard work and determination, and he violated its most fundamental rules. These paradoxes cannot be resolved through argument or explanation. They simply exist, like competing gravitational forces that hold Pete Rose's legacy in a kind of permanent suspension, neither fully celebrated nor completely condemned. The game goes on without him, as it always has and always will. New players emerge to chase his records. New stars capture the imagination of fans who never saw Pete Rose play. The business of baseball continues, generating new controversies and new heroes, new stories of triumph and disaster. But somewhere in the background, like a melody that cannot quite be forgotten, the story of Charlie Hustle continues to play, a reminder of how high a man can rise and how far he can fall, sometimes in the space of a single at-bat, sometimes over the course of a lifetime devoted to the pursuit of victories that can never quite fill the emptiness they were meant to cure. Pete Rose bet on baseball, and baseball bet on him. In the end, they both lost. There is a photograph that captures something essential about Pete Rose, though it was taken years before anyone knew his name or suspected the darkness that would eventually consume him. He is perhaps 12 years old, standing in the infield of some forgotten sandlot in Cincinnati, his uniform too big and his glove too small, but his eyes already burning with the intensity that would define his entire life. The photograph is black and white, grainy with age, but the expression on his face is timeless, a look of pure hunger, of wanting something so badly that the wanting itself becomes a kind of religion. This is the Pete Rose who preceded the scandal, the child who would grow into the man who would accumulate more hits than anyone in the history of baseball. But even here, in this innocent moment, frozen in silver halide in time, you can see the seeds of what would come later. The same intensity that would drive him to slide headfirst into bases when a standing slide would suffice. The same refusal to accept limits that would keep him playing professional baseball until he was 45 years old. These qualities are already present, written in the set of his jaw and the focus of his gaze. The boy in the photograph could not have imagined the man he would become, could not have foreseen the moment when that same intensity would lead him to risk everything he had achieved for the temporary thrill of a winning bet. But the capacity was there, dormant but unmistakable, like a genetic predisposition that waits for the right circumstances to express itself. Pete Rose was born to want things, to want them with an urgency that bordered on desperation, and that wanting would shape every decision he made for the rest of his life. In the summers of his youth, before air conditioning made indoor activities appealing, and before television offered 1,000 alternatives to outdoor play, Rose lived at the local baseball diamond. He arrived early and stayed late, long after the other kids had gone home for dinner. He practiced his swing against imaginary pitchers, fielded ground balls that existed only in his mind, ran the bases with the focused determination of someone preparing for the World Series rather than neighborhood pickup games. His father, Harry Rose, worked construction and understood the value of persistent effort. He had immigrated from Germany as a young man, carrying nothing but a willingness to work harder than anyone else, and a belief that America rewarded such effort with opportunity. He passed these values to his son not through lectures, but through example, leaving for work each morning before dawn, and returning each evening with hands that bore the honest calluses of physical labor. But Pete's intensity went beyond what his father had taught him, beyond what could be explained by upbringing or environment. There was something almost mystical in his relationship with baseball, as if he had been born understanding truths about the game that other players had to learn through years of experience. He could read the spin on a curveball from the moment it left the pitcher's hand, could anticipate where a ground ball would bounce based on the angle of the bat and the conditions of the field. These were not conscious calculations but intuitive responses, the way a bird knows when to migrate or a flower knows when to bloom. The local coaches noticed him immediately, not because he was the biggest or the strongest or the fastest, but because he played with a seriousness that was unusual in someone so young. While other kids joked and goofed around between innings, Rose studied the game, watching how different pitchers approached different hitters, memorizing the tendencies of opposing players, absorbing lessons that would serve him throughout his professional career. He made the high school varsity team as a freshman, an almost unheard-of achievement that spoke to his exceptional ability and mature approach to the game. By his senior year, he was attracting attention from professional scouts, men in worn suits and baseball caps who sat in the stands with notebooks and stopwatches, timing his speed to first base, and evaluating his swing mechanics with the practiced eyes of people who made their living identifying talent. The Cincinnati Reds signed him as an amateur free agent in 1960, offering a modest bonus that reflected their assessment of his potential. Rose was not considered a future star, not the kind of player who generates excitement and newspaper headlines. He was viewed as a solid prospect, someone who might eventually contribute to a major league team if he continued to develop and avoided serious injury. The scouts saw his hustle and his intelligence, but they missed the fire that burned inside him, the relentless drive that would eventually carry him far beyond their modest expectations. He began his professional career in the Geneva Redlegs of the New York Penn League, a short-season Class D team that served as the first step on the long ladder to the major leagues. The ballparks were small and poorly maintained, the crowds were sparse, and the pay was barely enough to cover living expenses. But Rose approached each game with the same intensity he would later bring to World Series competition, treating every at-bat as if his entire future depended on the outcome. The minor league years were an education in persistence, a daily lesson in the gap between dreams and reality. Rose lived in boarding houses and ate at diners, traveled on buses that broke down in small towns whose names he would never remember, played games in front of crowds that sometimes numbered in the dozens rather than the thousands. But he never complained, never expressed doubt about his chosen path, never suggested that the sacrifices were too great for the uncertain rewards they might eventually produce. He advanced through the Reds' farm system with methodical determination, moving from Geneva to Tampa to Macon to San Diego, accumulating statistics and developing skills that would eventually carry him to Cincinnati. Each level presented new challenges, better pitching, more sophisticated strategies, higher expectations, but Rose adapted to each one with the same focused intensity that had characterized his approach to the game since childhood. In 1963, at the age of 22, he made his major league debut with the Cincinnati Reds. The moment was less dramatic than he had imagined during all those years of preparation. He struck out in his first at-bat, grounded out in his second, and went hitless in his first game. But something about the experience, the size of the crowd, the quality of the competition, the sense of finally arriving at the destination he had been traveling toward for years, confirmed his belief that this was where he belonged. The early years in Cincinnati were a mixture of success and struggle, moments of brilliance punctuated by periods of doubt and adjustment. Rose established himself as a reliable player, someone who could be counted on to give maximum effort and produce consistent results, but he was not yet the superstar he would eventually become. He was still learning, still discovering the subtleties of major league hitting, still developing the reputation for hustle that would eventually earn him the nickname Charlie Hustle. The transformation from good player to great player happened gradually, over seasons rather than months, through the accumulation of small improvements and refined techniques. Rose learned to hit to all fields, to work counts in his favor, to steal bases at crucial moments, to turn routine plays into spectacular ones through sheer determination. He developed the habit of running to first base on walks, not because he thought it would help him reach base faster, but because the act of running was itself a statement of purpose, a physical manifestation of his refusal to accept anything less than maximum effort. By the late 1960s, Rose had become one of the most recognizable players in baseball, known as much for his style as for his statistics. He played with a joy that was infectious, celebrating good plays with the enthusiasm of a little leaguer, and treating every game as if it were the most important contest ever played. Fans responded to his authenticity, his obvious love for the game, his willingness to get his uniform dirty in pursuit of victory. The Cincinnati Reds of the 1970s were built around Rose's leadership and intensity. With players like Johnny Bench, Joe Morgan, and Tony Perez, they formed one of the greatest teams in baseball history, a collection of talent that complemented Rose's drive with skill and intelligence. They won World Series championships in 1975 and 1976, establishing themselves as a dynasty that combined individual excellence with collective purpose. Rose was the catalyst for this success, the player who set the tone and established the standards that others followed. He was the first to arrive at the ballpark and the last to leave, the player who studied opposing pitchers most carefully and prepared most thoroughly for each game. His statistics during this period were impressive. Batting titles, All-Star selections, MVP awards. But his true contribution went beyond numbers. He created a culture of excellence that elevated everyone around him. But even during these peak years, there were signs of the restlessness that would eventually lead to his downfall. Rose had always been a competitor, someone who needed action and excitement to feel fully alive. Between games, when the adrenaline of competition faded and the stadium emptied, he sought other outlets for the energy that baseball provided only temporarily. He frequented racetracks and casinos, places where the same competitive instincts that served him so well on the baseball field could be channeled into different activities. Initially, this gambling was social rather than compulsive, a way to extend the feeling of competition beyond the confines of the baseball season. Rose would bet on horse races with teammates, play poker in clubhouse card games, wager small amounts on football and basketball games. The money involved was insignificant, pocket change for a man earning hundreds of thousands of dollars playing baseball. But the psychological satisfaction was important, the sense of having action on events that might otherwise be merely entertaining. The transition from casual gambling to something more serious happened gradually, so gradually that Rose himself probably didn't recognize it until it was too late to reverse course. The amounts increased slowly, the frequency of betting became more regular, the types of wagers expanded to include sports and events that Rose knew nothing about. What had begun as entertainment became routine, then compulsive, then necessary. By the time Rose became manager of the Cincinnati Reds in 1984, his gambling activities had evolved into a parallel career that demanded as much attention and energy as his baseball responsibilities. He maintained relationships with bookmakers in multiple cities, kept detailed records of his betting activities, spent hours each day analyzing odds and point spreads. The notebook in his back pocket, which teammates assumed contained baseball-related information, was actually filled with gambling data. Team standings, injury reports, weather conditions, and other factors that might influence the outcomes of games on which he had wagered money. The irony was perfect and terrible. Pete Rose, who had built his reputation on complete dedication to baseball, was dividing his attention between the game that had made him famous and activities that violated the fundamental rules governing that game. The same mental energy that had once been focused exclusively on hitting and fielding was now scattered across dozens of different contests and outcomes, most of which had nothing to do with baseball. The other coaches and players noticed changes in Rose's behavior, though they probably didn't understand their significance at the time. He became more secretive, more likely to take phone calls in private and conduct conversations that others weren't meant to overhear. His mood swings became more pronounced, his temper more unpredictable. He would be elated after receiving certain phone calls and dejected after others, emotional responses that seemed unconnected to anything happening with the baseball team. Rose's gambling debts grew steadily larger, creating financial pressures that affected his decision-making in ways that extended far beyond his personal life. He owed money to people who operated outside the normal boundaries of legitimate business, men who expected their debts to be paid promptly and in full regardless of the borrower's other obligations. These debts created their own momentum, generating interest and penalties that compounded daily and required constant attention to manage. The pressure to generate cash flow to service these debts led Rose to make increasingly desperate wagers, betting larger amounts on outcomes he understood less and less well. He was no longer gambling for entertainment or even for profit in any rational sense. He was gambling to stay ahead of obligations that threatened consequences he preferred not to contemplate. Each bet was simultaneously an attempt to solve his financial problems, and a guarantee that those problems would become more complex and more dangerous. When Rose finally crossed the ultimate line and began betting on baseball games involving his own team, he probably told himself that it made no practical difference. He was betting on the Reds to win, which meant his financial interests aligned with his professional responsibilities. If anything, the bets should have made him a better manager, more motivated to make the strategic decisions that would give his team the best chance of victory. But this logic ignored the deeper implications of what he was doing. Baseball is not just about winning individual games. It's about managing resources across an entire season, making strategic decisions that might cost you tonight but improve your chances next week. When a manager has money riding on a particular game, these long-term considerations become secondary to the immediate need to cash a winning ticket. Pitchers might be used in situations that serve short-term betting interests rather than long-term team success. Players might be deployed in ways that maximize the chances of winning a specific game, rather than maintaining their health and effectiveness over a full season. More fundamentally, Rose's betting on his own team introduced an element of corruption into the competitive process that baseball depends on for its legitimacy. Fans invest emotional and financial capital in the belief that what they're watching is authentic competition, that all participants are trying their hardest to win within the established rules. When a manager bets on games he's managing, that authenticity is compromised regardless of which side he bets on. The mere existence of the financial stake changes the nature of the competition in ways that cannot be undone or explained away. The investigation that eventually exposed Rose's gambling activities was thorough and professional, conducted by people who understood the serious implications of what they were examining. They followed paper trails and recorded conversations, documented meetings, and analyzed financial records, building a case that would eventually fill multiple filing cabinets with evidence of systematic rule violations. The investigators worked quietly and carefully, aware that they were dealing with one of baseball's most famous personalities, and that any mistakes in their procedures would be seized upon by Rose's defenders as evidence of unfair treatment. They cross-referenced different sources of information, verified witness statements, and created timelines that showed patterns of behavior extending over months and involving significant amounts of money. Rose, meanwhile, continued his double life, managing the Reds while maintaining his gambling activities, apparently unaware that his every move was being monitored and documented. He functioned on multiple levels simultaneously, making strategic decisions about pitching rotations and lineup changes while calculating odds, planning bets on games he knew nothing about. The cognitive dissonance involved in maintaining these parallel existences must have been extraordinary. But Rose managed it with the same determination he had once brought to hitting curveballs and turning double plays. The strain began to show in his managing, though the changes were subtle enough that casual observers might not have noticed them. Rose had always been an emotional manager, someone who wore his feelings openly and reacted strongly to events on the field. But now his emotions seemed disconnected from the immediate circumstances of the games, more reflective of pressures and concerns that had nothing to do with baseball strategy or player performance. There were games where his decisions seemed influenced by considerations that went beyond normal managerial thinking. Pitchers left in longer than strategy would dictate, or removed earlier than the situation warranted. Defensive alignments that didn't match the tendencies of opposing hitters. Small departures from optimal strategy that might have been explained by hunches or intuition, but which in retrospect suggested the influence of factors that had nothing to do with giving the team the best chance to win. These deviations from normal practice were not dramatic enough to attract immediate attention from fans or media, but they were noticed by people within the organization who understood Rose's usual patterns of decision-making. Coaches and players began to wonder about his state of mind, his level of focus, his commitment to the team's success above all other considerations. By early 1989, the investigation had progressed to the point where formal charges were inevitable. The evidence was overwhelming, and the patterns of behavior were clear. Rose had been gambling on baseball games, including games involving his own team, in direct violation of rules that had been in place since the earliest days of organized baseball. The only remaining question was how the matter would be resolved, through private acknowledgement and negotiation, or through public hearings that would expose every detail of Rose's gambling activities to media scrutiny. Baseball, despite its reputation for harsh justice, preferred to handle such matters quietly when possible. The sport's image had already been damaged by various scandals over the years, and there was little enthusiasm for a prolonged public airing of Pete Rose's personal problems. If Rose was willing to admit his guilt and accept a reasonable punishment, the entire matter could be resolved through private negotiations that would minimize damage to all parties involved. But Pete Rose had never been in the habit of accepting defeat gracefully. His entire career had been built on the principle that persistence could overcome any obstacle, that refusing to quit was itself a form of victory. He had played through injuries that would have sidelined other players, continued competing long past the age when most athletes retire, accumulated records through sheer stubbornness and determination. The idea of admitting defeat, of acknowledging that he had been overcome by personal weaknesses, was foreign to everything he understood about himself and his place in the world. So, when Commissioner Bart Giamatti's investigators presented him with their evidence and offered him the opportunity to negotiate a settlement, Rose did what he had always done when faced with adversity. He fought back. He denied the allegations, questioned the motives of his accusers, hired expensive lawyers and public relations specialists, and prepared to contest every aspect of the case against him. The hearing that followed was unlike anything in baseball history, a legal proceeding that resembled a criminal trial more than a typical disciplinary action. For weeks, lawyers presented evidence and cross-examined witnesses while Rose sat at the defendant's table, his famous intensity now focused on legal strategy rather than batting practice. The man who had once been celebrated for his openness and accessibility became guarded and evasive, parsing every question as if his life depended on the precision of his answers. The evidence presented during the hearing was devastating in its completeness and clarity. Phone records showing hundreds of calls to known bookmakers. Financial documents revealing large cash transactions with no apparent legitimate purpose. Testimony from associates who described in detail the bets they had witnessed Rose place and the conversations they had overheard. photographs of Rose at locations where illegal gambling activities were known to occur. Each piece of evidence was small in itself, but collectively they formed a picture so complete and so damning that denial seemed not just futile but absurd. Rose's lawyers challenged individual documents and questioned the credibility of witnesses, but they could not overcome the weight of evidence that pointed to the same inescapable conclusion. Pete Rose had been gambling on baseball games, and some of those games involved the team he was being paid to manage. Rose himself took the stand in his own defense, subjecting himself to hours of cross-examination that revealed the depths of his self-deception and his willingness to parse words in ways that strained credibility. He admitted to gambling on other sports but denied betting on baseball. He acknowledged associating with bookmakers but claimed he had never placed bets with them. He explained away financial transactions and phone calls with elaborate stories that became more complex and less believable with each telling. The spectacle was painful to watch for anyone who had admired Rose's career and accomplishments. Here was Pete Rose, the man who had embodied baseball's virtues of hard work and determination, reduced to semantic quibbling and legal maneuvering. The same qualities that had made him great as a player, his refusal to accept defeat, his ability to find ways to succeed where others had failed, now worked against him, preventing him from acknowledging truths that everyone else could see clearly. On August 24, 1989, Commissioner Giamatti announced his decision. Pete Rose was banned from baseball for life, declared permanently ineligible, and prohibited from any involvement with organized baseball. The announcement was brief and formal, delivered without emotion or elaboration, but its implications were enormous. Rose's career was over, his legacy tainted, his future connection to the game he had served for nearly 3 decades severed completely. The punishment was immediate and absolute. Rose was removed from his position as manager of the Cincinnati Reds. His name was struck from all official team records, and his eligibility for the Hall of Fame was suspended indefinitely. All of this happened in the space of a single day. The accumulated achievements of 24 years as a player and 5 years as a manager rendered meaningless by a single administrative decision. Rose's initial response was characteristic: defiant denial mixed with self-righteous indignation. He claimed he was the victim of a conspiracy, targeted by officials who resented his success and popularity. He hired more lawyers and prepared appeals that would continue for years, promising to fight the decision through every available legal channel. He gave interviews proclaiming his innocence and challenging anyone to prove he had done anything wrong. But the evidence was too strong and too public to be overcome by legal tactics or public relations campaigns. Rose's former associates began to tell their stories in detail, describing the bets they had witnessed him place and the conversations they had overheard. Financial experts analyzed his banking records and found patterns of cash transactions that could not be explained by any legitimate activity. The case against him became stronger rather than weaker as more information became public. Gradually, the weight of evidence began to erode Rose's position. His denials became less categorical, his explanations more nuanced and qualified. He began to acknowledge that he might have made mistakes without admitting that he had done anything criminal. He suggested that his accusers might be telling partial truths while lying about the most serious allegations. He retreated step by step from his original position of absolute innocence toward something that resembled acknowledgement without quite reaching it. The process took years. Rose's legal appeals worked their way through baseball's administrative structure and into the federal court system, where each decision upheld the commissioner's ruling and found that the evidence supported the conclusions. But Rose continued to fight, unwilling to accept a verdict that would end his connection to the game that had defined his entire adult life. Meanwhile, baseball moved on without him. The Cincinnati Reds hired new managers and developed new stars. Other teams filled their coaching positions with men who had not been banned from the sport. The game that had once seemed unimaginable without Pete Rose's presence adapted to his absence with the same resilience that had allowed it to survive wars, economic depressions, and countless other challenges. Rose himself struggled to find a new identity and purpose. For nearly 30 years, he had been Pete Rose, the baseball player and manager. Now he was simply Pete Rose, a middle-aged man with no clear role and no obvious skills beyond those that had made him famous in a sport from which he was permanently excluded. He tried various business ventures, opened restaurants that failed, signed autographs at memorabilia shows, appeared on television programs where his notoriety was treated as a form of entertainment. These activities were pale substitutes for the intensity and purpose that had defined his existence when he was actively involved in baseball. He had become a celebrity rather than an athlete, famous for his disgrace rather than his accomplishments. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. Pete Rose was becoming a professional former baseball player, someone whose only remaining value lay in his willingness to discuss his failures in public. The years passed slowly. Rose's hair turned gray, then white. His body, which had once been a precision instrument calibrated for athletic competition, began to show the effects of age and inactivity. He put on weight, developed the soft appearance of a man whose physical challenges were no longer measured in innings and at-bats. The transformation was visible and irreversible. Pete Rose was becoming an old man whose best days were clearly behind him. But he never stopped hoping for reinstatement. Year after year, he submitted applications to be readmitted to baseball, hired new lawyers and public relations specialists, gave interviews expressing remorse and pledging to serve as an example for young players who might be tempted by similar activities. He did charity work and community service, trying to demonstrate that he had learned from his experience and deserved a second chance. The applications were rejected routinely, with form letters that explained baseball's position without offering any hope for future reconsideration. The sport's official position was that Rose had never fully acknowledged his guilt or taken complete responsibility for his actions. Until he was willing to tell the whole truth about his gambling activities, there could be no consideration of reducing his punishment. In 2004, 15 years after his banishment, Rose finally broke his silence partially. In a book titled My Prison Without Bars, he acknowledged for the first time that he had bet on baseball games, including some games involving his own team. The admission was carefully qualified and limited to specific time periods, but it represented a dramatic departure from 15 years of absolute denial. The confession should have been cathartic, a moment of truth that cleared the air and allowed everyone to move forward. Instead, it felt calculated and incomplete, timed to coincide with the book's publication and hedged with qualifications that suggested Rose was still not willing to tell the complete story. The admission raised as many questions as it answered, and satisfied neither his critics, who wanted complete honesty, nor his supporters, who had believed his denials and now felt betrayed. The years continued to pass. Rose's applications for reinstatement continued to be rejected. His appearances at memorabilia shows and autograph signings became routine, a predictable circuit of conventions and card shows where aging fans could meet the man who had once embodied their dreams of baseball glory. He signed thousands of photographs and baseballs, his signature becoming as much a commodity as his hitting had once been. In 2015, Commissioner Rob Manfred conducted a thorough review of Rose's case and concluded that there was still insufficient evidence of genuine reform to justify reinstatement. The decision was detailed and carefully reasoned, citing Rose's continued involvement with gambling activities and his failure to demonstrate the kind of character change that would be necessary before he could be trusted with any role in organized baseball. Rose responded with characteristic defiance, questioning the decision and maintaining that he had been treated unfairly by a sport that should have been grateful for his contributions. But his protests carried less weight now, the complaints of an old man whose relevance was measured in decades rather than years. The game had moved on without him, developed new stars and created new controversies, built new memories to replace the ones he had provided. And so Pete Rose remains in exile, the hit king without a kingdom. The man who accumulated more hits than anyone in baseball history, but cannot be considered for the Hall of Fame because of decisions he made away from the field. He is 82 years old now, his hair white as winter snow, his body bearing the accumulated weight of years and regrets that cannot be undone or explained away. He still signs autographs at memorabilia shows, still gives interviews to reporters who want to rehash the details of his fall from grace. But the audience for these performances grows smaller each year, as fans who remember his playing days are replaced by younger generations who know him primarily as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly greatness can be transformed into something else entirely. The tragedy of Pete Rose is not simply that he gambled on baseball, though that was certainly tragic enough. The real tragedy is that he gambled away everything that made him special, trading the respect and admiration of millions of fans for the temporary thrill of action and the false promise of easy money. He had achieved something that very few people in any field ever achieve. He had become the best in the world at something that mattered to millions of people. He had earned a place in history, a legacy that should have lasted long after his death. And he threw it all away for betting slips and point spreads, for the illusion of control over outcomes that were always beyond anyone's control. There are lessons in Pete Rose's story, but they are not simple lessons that can be reduced to easy morals about the dangers of gambling or the importance of following rules. The truth is more complex and more disturbing. The same qualities that make someone great at one thing can destroy them in another context. Rose's intensity, his refusal to accept defeat, his belief that wanting something badly enough could make it happen, these were the traits that made him a great baseball player. They were also the traits that made him a compulsive gambler, unable to walk away from bets even when the stakes had grown beyond his ability to pay. Pete Rose wanted to win at everything, and that universal desire for victory ultimately cost him the one thing he had actually mastered. He remains the hit king, but he reigns over a kingdom he can never visit, a realm of memory and record books from which he is permanently exiled. His 4,256 hits are still there in the official records, but they exist like artifacts from a civilization that no longer acknowledges his existence. The story continues even now, though its ending seems predetermined. Rose continues to apply for reinstatement, continues to hope that somehow the passage of time will soften the hard edges of justice. Baseball continues to reject his applications, maintains its position that some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. And fans continue to debate whether a lifetime ban is appropriate punishment for betting on games, whether Rose's achievements as a player should outweigh his failures as a manager and citizen. These debates will likely continue long after Pete Rose is gone, long after everyone who saw him play has joined him in whatever realm awaits former ballplayers. But the essential facts will remain unchanged. Pete Rose was the greatest hitter in baseball history, and Pete Rose was banned from baseball for life because he could not resist the temptation to gamble on the games he was managing. Both statements are true, and neither one cancels out the other. They exist together in the permanent record, twin monuments to human achievement and human failure, reminders that greatness and tragedy are often separated by nothing more than a single decision, a single moment when a person chooses who they want to be. In Pete Rose's case, that moment came not in a stadium filled with cheering fans, but in a quiet office where a middle-aged man picked up a telephone and placed a bet that would cost him everything he had spent his lifetime trying to achieve. The bet was placed, the money was lost, and the consequences followed with the inexorable logic of cause and effect. Pete Rose gambled on baseball, and in the end, baseball had to choose between Pete Rose and its own integrity. The choice was not difficult, though it was certainly painful. Baseball chose itself, as it always has and always will, because the game is bigger than any individual player, no matter how many hits he accumulated or how many records he set. And so the Hit King sits on his throne in a kingdom he cannot enter, ruling over subjects who cannot acknowledge his reign. It is a strange form of immortality, but it is immortality nonetheless, purchased with the very currency that should have secured his place among the gods of the game. He loved too much and understood too little.